Coming up on Dr. Kiki Science Hour, we're talking about the math in our lives with Jennifer Ouellette, writer and author of the Calculus Diaries. That's up next on Dr. Kiki Science Hour.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit. Bandwidth for Dr. Kiki's Science Hour is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Dr. Kiki's Science Hour with Dr. Kiki, episode number 72, recorded on Thursday, November 11th, 2010, Veterans Day. It's a math world. Welcome, everyone, to Dr. Kiki's Science Hour. It's the hour where we talk about science, the whole hour. It's pretty exciting, right? We dig in for an entire hour into a single subject with a single expert, and it's not really very often that you get that in this world, an hour of dedicated expertise. Well, today, episode 72, it's a math world. We are talking with Jennifer Ouellette, and she is a writer. She has written such great books as The Physics of the Buffyverse, for those of you who are Joss Whedon fans out there. And more recently, her book is The Calculus Diaries. She's delved into the world of calculus and how calculus and math are involved in our everyday lives. So hopefully, whether or not you are a math lover or someone who goes, math, and it makes you want to faint just hearing the four-letter word that it is, you know, hopefully that we will have something wonderful in this show for all of you. Jennifer, additionally, is a black belt in jiu-jitsu. So as a black belt myself in taekwondo, I feel like we've got a pretty good, powerful pairing here. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me and joining us on the show. Let's kick some math. Pleasure. Let's kick some math butt, right?
All right.
To get started, what was it that, I mean, you have a physics blog, Cocktail Party Physics. You've been writing about science for years. Physics seems to have been a big focus of a lot of your writing. Why move to calculus and math?
Well, I mean, for starters, I don't think that you can separate the two. Calculus and math is a huge part of physics. I had kind of avoided that for a very long time. I'm sure a lot of people know this about me. I'm a former English major who kind of drifted into science writing. So, and I'm math phobic, you know, so I wrote about physics for all these years and completely avoided the math. And it became very clear to me that I was missing out. Not so much that you can't understand some basic physics concepts without math, but your understanding is so much deeper. And the story that I like to tell is I was talking to one of my editors at the time at the American Physical Society, Alan Chodos, about an experiment that I'd seen, you know, at an educational workshop. It was the classic coin and the feather dropped in the vacuum sort of thing, so you can actually see that objects fall at the same rate regardless of mass. When we see that in the real world, our eyes kind of deceive us. Mm-hmm. There's all these other forces that are acting on the objects. There's friction, there's surface, there's all these various things that affect the rate at which an object falls. But if you see it done in a vacuum, you can actually see, wow, you know, it's true. These things actually do fall roughly at the same rate. And I was astounded that Galileo, way back when, hundreds of years ago, knew not to trust his eyes. And I asked Alan, how did he know? And Alan said, look, because I know you hate equations, and I can sit here and explain to you why. But you don't have to take this on faith, because if you just let me walk you through the equation, you will immediately see, based on the derivation, why this must be so. And I'm math phobic. Math is a four-letter word, so I'm like, no, I don't want to do that.
Why would I want to do that? Yeah.
And why? Why would I want to do that? And he went, oh, it's not real math. It's just algebra. So he walked me through it, and he was right. I mean, you actually, for anyone who knows this particular derivation, you have a big M for the mass of the Earth, and then you have little m's for the mass, a little m for the mass of the object or objects. And that little m during the course of the derivation cancels out. it's completely irrelevant to the rate at which an object falls. You know, it's not that mass doesn't have some effect on gravity, but when you've got such a huge mass of the Earth, the incidental mass of the objects falling is immaterial. It's just simply not relevant. So then I thought, wow, this is actually kind of cool. A mathematical equation has helped me see something that my eyes would deceive me on. You know, there's certain counterintuitive notions in physics. Special relativity was another one that he walked me through the equations on. Yeah, again,
that seems, you know, that's not low-level physics that you're dealing with.
Well, you know, but believe it or not, if you get walked through it, it's actually very simple. I'm with you. I was kind of thinking, well, yeah, I really don't think I can do this. But I was really kind of grappling with the whole length contraction, time dilation thing. And when you look at the math, it becomes immediately obvious why this must be so. And so those were two examples where math really helped me. And then I thought, you know, there's a lot of math books out there, but it's never been written about by someone who actually doesn't like it very much and who is kind of afraid of it. So that the Calculus Diaries became my journey.
Yeah, I feel like the perspective of somebody who, you know, as you said, an English major, you didn't come from a science background, you didn't love math growing up, this is something you've come into, it's got to be a valuable perspective for people reading the book to be able to relate to it. I mean, to be honest, a majority of people that I come across do not have nice things to say about math.
No, they don't. And I quote several of them in the book. You know, one woman compared it to a horrible yeast infection.
Ouch!
And she was just, she was like, it's like this toothed monster hiding under the bed. You know, she just hated it. She would rather deal with anything except a math equation. And people have very physical reactions to it. They get sweaty palms. They feel nauseous. I just got this knot in the pit of my stomach at looking at an equation. And there's many reasons for where this sort of math anxiety comes from. But the truth is, you know, when you delve into writing a book about calculus and you don't have a lot of the background, you don't make a lot of assumptions about what people know and don't know. And I discovered that there's a lot of things in calculus textbooks where they assume a certain level of knowledge, like what is a function? You can Google that and you can find a perfectly valid technical definition. You can find several, but that's probably not going to be very helpful to someone who doesn't have a lot of math background. Whereas if you actually, you know, did what I did, which was kind of take it apart and rebuild a function from scratch, what I was really asking, it turns out, when I said what is a function is, where does this come from? You know, you're giving me this equation and you're saying, here's your starting equation, and using this, you want to, like, this is what calculus is. You have a starting function, then you basically use that to deduce something else, like a new function. And that will tell you a piece of information that you don't have. I wanted to know where we got that starting function, and that's something that most textbooks skip over.
Completely.
So, yeah. So, you know, I was asking the obnoxious 3-year-old, but why questions. But those are the questions students care about.
Yeah, to take it back to its roots and to be able to figure out where it all comes from, as opposed to taking it, as you said, taking it on faith. Right, just believe me. This is what it is. Just believe me. Trust me. It's like, but why?
Exactly.
So with it, did you, as you were going through and finding out, you know, the basis of a particular function, learning about these things, did you also delve into the history, like the stories of what was actually happening when people were discovering these things?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think you can ignore history, particularly in something like science. I mean, I think you can never ignore history, but since science in particular builds on everything that came before, you really can't understand something like calculus until you figure out where it came from. So I went all the way back to Archimedes and the ancient Greeks and the method of exhaustion, which was the underpinning essentially of integral calculus. And I think it was the invention of algebra and the merging of that you actually had the beginnings, merging of that with geometry, that you actually had the beginnings of differential calculus. And then you got Newton and Leibniz in the 1600s, who essentially, you know, put the whole thing together and finally, you know, independently came up with this. I don't think you can ignore that. And there's some great stories. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I ended up talking about was storytelling. I would come up with anecdotes. Probability theory, believe it or not, is is based on a bunch of wealthy patrons with gambling problems who hired scientists and mathematicians to help them win more money.
I love it.
I know. Who knew? And so I got these great stories from history on people who worked on probability, and invariably they were being asked to do so by a wealthy patron who wanted to do better at dice games.
Wow. Do you think that there's a lot of that, the funding, that there was somebody rich on the sidelines who's like, I need some help in this area?
Yeah, well, we forget that there was a patron system, particularly in Western Europe, for much of science. I mean, someone had to pay for this. Someone had to support the scientists, and invariably it was the nobility, it was the king's courts, it was the people with money. So those were the ones that had the money to actually support scientists and mathematicians. Now we have funding agencies, but it's kind of the same thing. There's still this attitude of, what can you do for me?
Right. Funding agencies or Wall Street.
Exactly, yes.
For some of the stories that you learned, I'd love to have you tell a few anecdotes, tell a few stories. What were some of your favorites?
Well, I can tell you that one of my favorite, I approached the whole subject through geometric curves, those bell curves and parabolic curves and exponential decay curves and things like that, because that's kind of the faces of the mathematical functions. That's what they look like in a visual format. And I loved that. I'm a fairly visual person, so it kind of helped me deal with the abstraction if I could see a face of some sort. And my favorite one, and I swear one of these days I'm going to get a tattoo of this on my lower back, is called The Witch of Agnesi. And it's called that because of a rare female mathematician named Maria Gaetana Agnesi, who lived, I can't remember which century. I think it was the 17th century. No, 18th century. And she was known as the walking polyglot because by the age of 9, she could speak like 7 different languages. Wow. And she was, and her father was very wealthy. Invariably, when you had women who were good at math and science in those days, they tended to come from nobility or from wealthy families, because those were the only places where a woman indulging in that sort of thing would have been tolerated.
Right.
So, she was asked to perform at her father's salons and things like that, which she hated. But one of the things that she did was she wrote a popular, for the time, math book. She wrote the first popular description of calculus in Western Europe. It was, and one of the curves that she talks about in there is the Witch of Agnesi. And it's this beautiful, it looks kind of like one of those mantle clocks that kind of does this kind of curved mantle clock that sits on the clock.
Right.
And it describes resonance. It describes, if you're pushing someone in a swing, if you match exactly or close to exactly the rate of the swing, that would form, if you plotted that out in a graph form, it would form the Witch of Agnesi. So I love the fact that she, wrote about this curve. It's called the Witch of Agnesi through a translation problem. One of the words, l'avversaria, was essentially mistranslated as witch. There it is. Exactly.
So one of the words was mistranslated as witch, but that's not what it came from?
Yeah, or old hag or something like that. And it became known as the Witch of Agnesi. And I just think it's a lovely, whimsical way to describe a mathematical curve. So that's just a sampling. In terms of probability, you had this poor man named Cardano who wanted to be a physician. He supported himself through dice games. It turns out he was just very, very good at intuitively figuring out, how best to excel at dice games. And he wrote a definitive treatise on the sample space, the law of the sample space. But he had a very colorful life. I think he probably would have been very successful if he had not had children, because he just had this trio of bad seeds. I think the line I use in the book is they would make Caligula blush.
Wow.
I mean, one of the brothers slept with his sister and got her pregnant, and she had an abortion, and she continued to sleep around and got syphilis and then got married off to some old guy. And the son who got her pregnant ended up being executed for murdering his wife. And the other son became a member of the Spanish Inquisition and threw his own father in prison. So the poor guy, Cardano, the father, basically died insane and alone and impoverished.
And he's trying to find out the probability of how could all these bad things happen to any one person.
Well, he was really lucky in dice, and I think that was a trade-off. He got really unlucky in life.
Wow. So I love the fact that there are these really rich stories and histories, and I think that's lost a lot in education. There's such a push towards just, know the equation, be able to pass the test, get a good grade, kind of a format within education. I mean, I remember myself, I always enjoyed math, but I couldn't enjoy it the way that I wanted to because there was the pressure of having to pass a test and having to do, make sure that I could get it, just get the grade. And I think if there were the addition of these stories of the people who ended up, building the math that we use today, it would be so much more interesting to the kids who are learning it.
Right. There's nothing wrong with telling the occasional little story, a little short little anecdote in class while you're, and by the way, while you're doing this, while you're thinking about this problem, let me tell you about the person who came up with it or the person who solved it.
Right.
And, I think it's true. There's a lot of pressure to pass a test. There's a lot of pressure on teachers to meet the core requirements and get their kids to, do well on all these tests. And there's not a lot of time for this sort of thing, which is too bad. So that's an advantage, I think, to learning it as an adult, is because you can do this solely for the joy of it. You can take your time. I wasn't on a timeline. So I could sit there and argue with my physicist husband for half an hour about the limit. And, and as a result of that, I ended up with a much deeper understanding of it. I still have a hard time with infinity. Most of us do. But I have a much better understanding of things like that now because I was able to devote the time. Now, the downside is I was rusty on all my math. Even though I'd done well in my math classes in high school, I had to review algebra, geometry, and trigonometry before I could even get to the calculus. I just had to remember what it was I'd already learned. And there's also much less time when you have to make a living, when you don't have a lot of leisure time. So, I mean, it's a catch-22. I mean, in high school, you're too busy trying to get the grade, and when you're an adult, you're too busy trying to pay the rent. So, I think it would be very arrogant of me to sit there and tell a single working mom, you should be home at night learning calculus, when she's trying to feed her kids and working 2 jobs,
Right. The expectation, the time, the amount of time that is necessary, you really have to be able to put it aside. Did you find, some people, if they want to, they'll take a class, because that'll at least give them a structure to how they're going to approach it. How did you just bite the bullet and dig into it? I mean, you said you first had to go back and review what you'd previously learned, but what was your process? Did you look at what teachers were doing and going, okay, I'll just teach myself the way I think I would be taught in a class?
No, I didn't. I did not take the classroom approach because I didn't learn about physics in a traditional classroom, and I think I ended up with a pretty decent basic layman's knowledge of physics as a result. So I used that approach, what had worked for me in the past, and I essentially just followed my curiosity, because I think that that's something that you don't really have the luxury of doing very often. So I would go into a situation and say, all right, what are interesting questions I can ask, say, at Disneyland or about in a Vegas casino that math could help me answer? And I think that's something that gets missed, the creativity of math, that this stuff doesn't just get handed to you on a platter, that you can actually use these as tools to create your own questions and solve and be creative in your use of math. So I built my problems from scratch, so to speak, and I used some textbooks. I used The Complete Idiot's Guide to Calculus and a couple of others as helpful guides. And of course, my physicist husband was there to talk me through things. Yeah. We would start by having a discussion. What's going on here? And I knew enough physics that I could spot some physics. And of course, where there's physics, there's going to be calculus of some sort. There's going to be math. There's going to be calculus if you take it to that level. So I'm very good at spotting the physics. And then I just had to figure out how to look a little deeper and find the math related to that physics. And that process, I think, really helped me approach it kind of from the inside out. You end up with a much deeper understanding of why you're doing what you're doing. And so when you finally get to the grunge work, the actual solving of the problems, it's a little bit more meaningful. I was a little more willing to dig through all those rote mechanics because I kind of knew what I was doing and where I was going. Now, a lot of these real world problems are far, far too difficult for a beginning calculus student.
Right.
You need essentially a computer You can't find an integral of a bell curve, in a certain situation. You need a computer to crunch those numbers usually. I mean, you can, but it would take you days. So they get complicated very, very quickly. But I think there's a problem, there's a disconnect between textbook problems, which are understandably simplified, but the students don't actually know that. I mean, all these students say, well, on the one hand, bears being eaten by a giant anaconda and how that population changes. That's not really very realistic to me. That's never going to happen. Zombie outbreak, that I can relate to. And, to solve that with calculus, it requires, a very advanced model of coupled differential equations. And maybe they can't solve that, but you can walk them through the concepts and explain how it works and what each piece means. And say, and now, based on this, we're going to do a simplified version of this just for proof of concept, and this is what you'll be tested on. So it makes they understand that what they learn in the textbook is just a practice thing, and it's not how they're going to be using it in the real world. I think we need to address that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you think there's someone in the chat room who mentioned that math is like a language, and that learning languages as a child is easier? Do you think there was some aspect of math as a language in your learning of the calculus?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I say as much in the epilogue that really, an equation is a sentence, and I think one of the taglines that I used is, every equation tells a story. Each chapter in the book is based on one particular geometric curve, and it's essentially a riff, on the stories behind that particular equation. And a lot of the rules in math, if you do something to one side of the equal sign, you have to do the same thing to the other. If you change it in one way, then there's other things that have to be changed. The same thing happens when you rearrange a sentence. If you change, if you change from a first person to a second person, you're going to have to change the verb tense and a few other things as well. If you make suddenly your subject becomes your predicate and that sort of thing, or you use the passive voice, these are all rules that, kick in. And most of us learn those instinctively because we use language all the time. We don't always use math. It's interesting. There's an issue of innate ability. I bought into this fallacy that I was just not innately good at math.
Right.
And I think it's true that I gravitated towards words and towards writing, but I was challenged on this by a cognitive psychologist. She goes, think back. She says, when did you first learn to read? And I said, well, gosh, I must have been like 4 years old. And I said, and really, as soon as I could read and write, I was playing around with words and starting to write my own things. She goes, and did you do that with math? And I went, well, actually, no. She goes, well, of course you weren't as comfortable with numbers and symbols as you were with letters, because really it's just numbers and symbols. And a language, words are really just symbols. We have letters. Look, letters are symbols. So it was really just a matter of familiarity and practice. I did find that there's certain really basic, little tasks in calculus that I can now do quite easily just for the virtue of practicing them so long. They come up so often.
So there is a certain amount of the familiarity. I love the idea that if we were to introduce math and numbers to our kids at the same age that we start introducing reading and writing, reading and writing is the primary skill that kids are taught here. And if we were to also put right beside that math, there would be much less difficulty.
Well, I think at least numbers, because it's kind of like, we learn a language, say a Romance language, and then you try and learn Chinese or ancient Sanskrit. It's a completely different alphabet. It makes it doubly hard. And I think that's what's happening with math. It's a completely different alphabet.
Right.
So, there seems to be this idea that young children will not be able to grasp a lot of the abstraction of mathematics at that young age, so we don't bother teaching it to them. But if nothing else, we should be teaching them what the symbols mean and that these are things to be manipulated just like language. I would be very, very interested to see if that makes a difference. I suspect it would.
Yeah, I would be interested in seeing that also. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's make it happen.
Well, you're the one with a little one on the way. I suggest you practice.
Right. I'll get started now.
Yeah.
Just pipe the numbers into the belly.
Exactly. this is an integral sign.
That would be, we'll paint it on the walls in the nursery, right?
You know, it's interesting when you look at women who fell in love with math. Invariably, they became like Mary Somerville in the 1800s. Was really just kind of, you know, a young Victorian housewife, and she became fascinated by these symbols and numbers in a puzzle, and taught herself. She became fascinated by it as a language. And when you read biographies of her, there's always this kind of condescending, well, of course, she did know original mathematics, but she was a wonderful communicator about, you know, what was done at the time. And I went, well, of course she couldn't do any original mathematics. It took her the same amount of time, you know, just to learn the language because no one bothered to teach it to her. You know, so when you're always 10 steps behind, of course you're going to, your original research is going to suffer a little. But I think it does show that it is a language and that it can be learned, and it can be learned independently.
Yeah. In writing and going through this process yourself, there's this idea that for educating in the sciences called the Physics First program, where students start with physics, just the general principles. And it seems like you've kind of done that. I mean, you've gone through all your educational stages, the traditional educational stages, but in terms of your adult education, it seems as though you're doing this physics first route to figuring things out. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that's probably true. That was not deliberate on my part. Like I said, it was completely by accident. But I do think there's some validity to that. When I think back to my high school classes, it was the usual. You start with, you know, social science, biology, chemistry. Since I skipped my senior year, I never took physics. So I do think that it's so fundamental and so basic, and the concepts really can be understood. That's something that probably could be taught sooner. And certainly if you're learning calculus, it should be taught at the same time as physics. I do not understand, you know, how you can really grasp, unless you're already inclined to think abstractly or already good with numbers.
Right.
I think most students, you know, would prefer to learn those together. I talked to a lot of physicists and mathematicians, and believe it or not, I would say 65% of them taught themselves calculus. And even those that, like my husband, who did very, very well in calculus, said, you know, I didn't really start to understand why it was so important until I started using it in physics. And that certainly mirrors what I discovered. Like I said, I mean, I was able to find the physics, say, in Disneyland, and then from there, figure out interesting calculus questions to ask, or math questions to ask. And that, I think, helped me put math in a context. And you still need the abstraction. You know, I think one of the things that a lot of students in both physics, calculus, and math don't get is sometimes the connection between these functions. Mm-hmm. The fact that an exponential decay curve can describe the physics of a black hole. It can just the entropy of a black hole. It can describe the rate at which your cup of coffee cools. That will gradually form an exponential decay. The rate at which wet clothing will dry. Population dynamics, economics, you see the same functions, the same curves in multiple applications. And after a while, you start to see and appreciate the power of abstraction.
For the stuff that you're learning, what have you or you have learned for the book? What was the most useful implementation of calculus that you came across?
Oh, actually, it was in the economics chapter. Basic. I've actually been pretty good with things like compound interest and things like that. But I was really surprised. We were doing some house hunting, as it happens, right about this time, and it turns out that looking for a house can be made into a multivariable optimization problem. And I was fascinated by the fact that pretty much any time you comparison shop, that's essentially what you're doing. If you think about the process, you have a list of things that are important to you. You know, square footage, location. You want this many number of bedrooms, whatever, and it's say an infinite number of houses to choose from, and you're constrained by cost, unless your name is, you know, Bill Gates. Most of us are constrained by cost. And so each one of those variables, each one of those things that is important to you becomes a variable, and then you just have to quantify it and give it a value. And then you can actually use this to construct a function and use it to figure out, where to look, where to look on that particular curve to find, the houses that will have the optimal combination of those features. And it's interesting. I was talking to another woman who's married to a physicist who had just bought a house. And I told her this story. She went, "Oh my God, my husband did the exact same thing." It's just, and I of course would just use an Excel sheet and do pros and cons of the various things. But you actually can, if you go to the trouble of setting up the function, of setting up the equation, it can save you a lot of time.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So everybody out there looking for a house right now, you can use calculus. It'll help help you pick your house.
And it can certainly help in Vegas. I mean, that's in the title of the book, How Math Can Help You Lose Weight, Win in Vegas, and Survive a Zombie Apocalypse. A really good understanding of probability theory and the odds and how Vegas stacks the deck, and how you can maybe not win in Vegas, but lose more slowly.
Right.
Make your money go further so you can get as much fun as possible out of your limited bankroll. There's lots of little mathematical tricks that you can use to do that. And
like the D max of fun. That's
exactly. So our calculus problem there was to maximize your fun. And the way to do that is to lose money as slowly as possible. And of course, sometimes you hit one of those probabilistic sweet spots and you actually come out ahead. We played craps for an hour and we actually ended up making, between the two of us, I think $150.
Nice.
But had we continued playing, I guarantee we would have lost it all.
Yeah. From a probability standpoint, craps is not the best game to just keep staying at the table. It's good to learn when to walk away.
Exactly, but it's also instructive. I mean, it's a very small edge that the house has. It's 1.42% edge, and that doesn't sound like very much. And if you bet smart, you can actually whittle that down to almost a 1% edge. That's all it takes. That's why there's a big city in the middle of the desert that makes a lot of money. Exactly. That's all it takes to take all your money.
With all the money coming into it, if there's that much of an edge, it's just enough to take a little chunk from everybody.
Exactly. And every now and then they make a big payout, but it pales in comparison to what they make.
Are there any other really great, gambling and probability, the exponential decay curves, going shopping for a house, any other fun adventures that you had? It sounds like you traveled a bit for this book. Also, you didn't just stay home and do math.
No, I didn't. And that was actually part of it. First of all, it gives you stories. I mean, I got so many fantastic stories from the Vegas trip. We ended up learning craps at the New York casino. Nice. And, I was pleased to find that, a lot of these, the dealers are very, very upfront about the fact that the deck is stacked. They will warn you. They will basically say, "We are going to take your money."
Wow. Wow.
And this guy was telling me, I was talking to him, he goes, "Yeah," he goes, "There are these people, they come in, they think they got a strategy, they think they got a plan." And I always say, "You think you're going to break my table? Think again." He goes, "You can try." He goes, "We got ATMs all over the casino for people just like you." He said he would tell them this and they would still think that they were going to be the exception. I also went surfing in Hawaii, which was a lot of fun. I was out there to talk about wave fronts. There's a calculus equation called a Fourier transform.
Right.
And it has to do with acoustics, with all wave phenomena, light, sound, water waves, all these things, gravitational waves. Anytime you have a wave dynamic, you'll be able to describe it by periodic functions, and you could probably do a Fourier transform or analysis on it. And so I was there visiting a scientist named Milton Garces. He has an infrasound laboratory there on the Big Island. And he said, "Look, if you really want to understand wave fronts and wave dynamics, you got to go surfing." And they're right there on the ocean. So he and his entire lab, his wife loaned me all this equipment, took me to one of the local surfing haunts, the one that none of the tourists know about. And we spent an entire afternoon teaching me to surf. And it really works. Among other things, I found out that, how when you're about to catch a baseball Ah, yes.
XKCD, one of my favorite cartoons.
That's what a Fourier transform does. I mean, a key element of surfing is being able to analyze the waves. And what a Fourier transform does is it breaks a complex wave down into its component parts. And being able to eyeball those waves and kind of make that analysis is something that can be learned. I'm not very good at it. I'm also not very good at surfing. If you think about what a outfielder does when he catches a baseball,
but the reason for why you're not good at surfing and why you're not good at eyeballing the Fourier transforms, not necessarily the same reason.
Yeah, no, it's not, but it's a little more complicated. But if you think about what happens when you're trying to catch a baseball, your brain is taking an integral. It's calculating the changing position of that ball over time to make a prediction about where it's going to land, and so that you know where to be when to catch it. And that's similar to what you do when you catch a wave, except that you've got to take two separate integrals. You've got to not only be in the right place at the right time, but you've also got to be traveling at the same speed. You have to match the wave's frequency. And if you don't, it's just going to roll right past you and you're not going to catch the wave. It's a weird phenomenon. And anyone who's ever tried surfing knows that disheartening feeling of thinking you're about to catch the wave and it just kind of rolls past you and everyone else is having fun and you're bobbing forlornly on the ocean. So yeah, those are two elements of things that I use the surfing in Hawaii to talk about.
I think that's great. It's once again, just like you said, a great story. It's a great example, and you're able to take the complex example from the wave fronts and also from your own experience on the wave of trying to match these things together. How is this like baseball? How is it not like baseball? How does it all work together?
Right, and I think that's important. I think you have to understand this as a system. You know, that context is important. You don't want to just learn this, all by itself. You don't want to learn calculus in isolation, because calculus is meant to describe change and motion. Isaac Newton didn't invent calculus because he was interested in the abstractions. He invented calculus because he needed it as a tool to develop his laws of motion and his theory of gravity. This was the tool that he needed in order to solve these problems, and he invented it as a result. So, to kind of poo-poo applications and context, I think is a little dishonest.
Speaking of poo-pooing things, you made a comment about your experience in Vegas, and you're talking about the probability there. And I was reading your blog and came across a blog. You had an interview on the Mancow Show, which
oh yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could relate that experience, because I do think it it speaks very strongly to attitudes about math, attitudes about just who we think we should be, and where science and math fall into our lives.
Yeah, that was a really interesting experience. For a bit of context, it's very, very rare to see math on, on a non-science show. So any opportunity I have to be on one of those, I'm going to do it. I was on San Diego Living. I was locally on Tim Conway Jr.'s local radio show here in Pasadena. Mm-hmm. And so when Mancow's producer called and said that they wanted to talk about particularly the Vegas, I had done a piece for Discover on poker playing physicists, kind of an outgrowth of the chapter on Vegas. Probabilities in poker are much more complicated than in craps. And for some reason, this piqued Mancow's interest. I got a call from his producer. I had been warned, he's obviously, a right-wing radio host, and his show is, let's just say, not the most intellectual,
Right.
But, I can do light. I can do that. So I said, sure, I'll do this. And there's a time change, so I get up this ridiculously early in the morning, and I try and get up a little earlier so I'm at least awake and cogent. And literally, I don't think they did any prep work. He had no idea who I was. He'd never heard of Discover Magazine, or at least he claimed to have never heard of Discover Magazine. And I wasn't sure whether that was genuine or whether he was just using me to make a point, a kind of anti-intellectual, oh, you silly elitist point. Right. I have no idea what his motives were. But essentially, our conversation was me explaining to him what Discover Magazine was. I briefly described to him that I'd written an article on poker playing physicists. He asked me, oh, so they're like, doing like that card counting thing, so they're cheating. And I went, well, actually, no. It's actually a very complicated, it involves game theory and human psychology and all these various things. It really appeals, to the scientific mind. And he just cut me off, and he said, oh, he goes, well, I play blackjack. I'm a blackjack man. That's a man's game. And then he hung up on me.
And that was it. End of interview.
And that is what we are up against. I couldn't even talk even a little. And it's poker. Everybody loves poker. Celebrity Poker Showdown. Everybody watches, they play full tilt. I don't care what your political stripe is. Poker should not be controversial. But either he had not been sufficiently prepped, and then he realized that he didn't know he wasn't going to be able to hold his own, so he hung up on me rather than look stupid. Right. Or he was using me to score a point on anti-intellectualism. And my attitude is, okay, it was very instructive. This is what we're up against. He only wasted about 1 minute of my time. So, I had to get up early, but so what?
Right.
So I wasn't particularly upset about it, but it was very instructive, I think.
Yeah. I've been hung up on by Mancow myself.
Oh, okay.
So I'm there with you.
What did he hang up on you for? I mean, it's...
He decided, what was he... I don't remember what the interview was about, but he was going to ask me some questions about something, and then he just decided that my phone connection wasn't good enough, and so he just hung up on me. He asked me one question, and I tried answering the question, and he gave one comment back, and then hung up, and I was like, okay.
Well, I think I got off easy actually, because the guy before me, because you can listen to the show
right as you're on hold,
as you're on hold waiting for your turn, and there was this poor male caller who called in that to ask some sort of question, and Mancow just basically didn't even answer his question, just essentially made fun of him and made a lot of gay sex jokes. So
you got off without any sex jokes or anything. And
as a woman in science, I think that's actually pretty amazing.
So
I mean, come on, this happens to you all the time, right? You're a woman, you talk about science and math, and you go on a show of non-scientists, and the first thing that they're going to start doing is the sex jokes. They will do it.
Yeah. So. Have you had that much? I mean, you've been working in science communications for a long time. For the last couple of years, you've been involved in the Science and Entertainment Exchange. I know you're not working there currently. But have you've been interacting at the interface?
Yes, I have. And I loved that kind of work, but it's let's face it, it's not writing. And after a while, I found that I was really, really missing the writing. But it was interesting to see, because it's a little bit different. As a science writer, when I write nonfiction, I'm using narrative, I'm using story in the service of science. That situation is reversed when you're dealing with Hollywood. There, the science is in service to the story, and it is not the be-all and end-all. And so, the Exchange is a wonderful program because they understand that, and they're not trying to be the accuracy police. I think that if we took that route, we would end up with some very, very boring entertainment.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to play a little fast and loose with the facts. You've got to be able to bend things a little bit. It's a fictional world. It's a fictional thing. And so you're allowed to do that. But you can use those science-inspired stories to pique people's interests. And then the question becomes, how do you take that little spark of interest and then get them to want to delve further? Give them the resources to explore a little bit more. And I'm very excited about the potential of things like DVD extras and multimedia things on the web, interactive multimedia on the web, to do that. That's something I think has not been tapped. I know the Exchange will be working with a whole bunch of organizations to try and talk about how best to do that in the future.
Yeah, that would be really neat. That sounds like just a huge area that could be developed.
Right. And
for
because
the educational side of stuff, yeah.
And because it's such a huge undeveloped area, and particularly if you want to develop curriculum materials, you've got to bring the educators in, because they're not looking for a cool scene that they can kind of riff on. They actually need a scene that will specifically illustrate something in their curriculum that they're teaching that week. So it's a huge project, and I think that it's going to be baby steps before we get that. But again, I mean, this is a way of bringing in real science without getting in the way of the story. So you're not sacrificing entertainment, you're not sacrificing narrative, but you're basically saying, did you enjoy this story? Did you know that some of the science, is based on reality and you can learn more about how it really works? And then have the resources available for people who are intrigued by that. I don't know if you saw Lost University. It was an online interactive thing that Fox put up for season 5 of Lost.
Oh, yeah. I personally didn't watch Lost, so it wasn't something I dug into, but I did see it, yeah.
Well, the people who followed Lost are rabid.
Yes.
And what they did for the season 5 DVD, if you remember, season 5 had a subplot of time travel in it, which is very physics intensive. So they had, my husband, Sean Carroll, USC's Nick Warner, and I think one other Clifford Johnson, a USC string theorist, talking about the physics, little video lectures, mini lectures for lay people on the physics of time travel. And they were little mini courses. And they also had little mini courses from experts on Egyptian hieroglyphics and archaeology. French and Korean, which were 2 languages featured on the show because some of the characters spoke those languages, and then survival skills. And people had to take an entrance exam. They had to take a placement exam.
Whoa.
And they had to watch all of these, complete all the coursework, and then take a little exam, a little multiple choice exam at the end. And you'd think that, maybe 10 people would be that devoted. 50,000 and counting are graduates of Lost University. And to me, that just demonstrates the power of this medium to inspire people to want to learn more. Now, they're not necessarily going to go immediately to a class. They want something that they can learn a little bit more gradually and still have some fun. But over time, you can foster a lifelong interest in science, and maybe they might go on to take a class. You don't know.
Yeah, maybe that would be really, really amazing. As the author of the Buffyverse, the physics of the Buffyverse, are you a Joss Whedon fan? And are you looking at the other Joss Whedon universes that are created and looking at the physics? Do you critically analyze Joss Whedon's worlds?
I'm sure people expect me to say yes, but the truth of the matter is I was a Buffy fan long before I started thinking about the physics in it. I'm a Joss Whedon fan because I love his storytelling. I love his characters. I think he's consistently inventive. He takes huge artistic risks. They don't always pay off. I think Dollhouse, his most recent series, was very uneven. I mean, it had some really not very good episodes and some episodes that just had you weeping. They were so beautiful. There's a reason. It was a difficult series. It was a reason I think it got canceled. So I only wrote the Buffyverse book because I noticed that when I really started thinking about it, there was actually quite a bit of physics there, that there were rules to this fictional universe. And I think that's true of any fictional world, including the world of Dollhouse and Firefly, that you set up your rules. And then it's not so much that they have to match real world physics, but they have to be internally consistent. And Buffyverse, for the most part, was fairly consistent, I think, in its rules, particularly in things like the way it used magic. They had a thermodynamics of magic, believe it or not. You couldn't just snap your fingers and have something happen. There were rules about things you had to do. There were limits to what you could do. And that's important. Those constraints, those boundaries actually are what give rise to tension and conflict and creative storytelling. So I don't think that people tend to think that if you're looking at the physics of the Buffyverse, you're a big killjoy. And I disagree.
It's good. Just disagree. It's good. As we're getting to the end of the hour here, I just want to circle back to your blog and what you're doing there. You're prolific, to say the least. You are just the words flow from your fingertips on your blog, and with the books that you've written as well. Are there other stories, things that are piquing your interest right now that you're looking at for writing another book, or are you going to focus on the blog and other things? What are you doing?
I'm focusing on the blog and other things. I mean, I have ideas for other books. I have like 3 different ideas. And one of those ideas is actually trying my hand at fiction. And I'm just waiting for one of those to gel. But I do think that, especially after you finish a book, and I'm also coming off 2 years of running a national outreach program, you need to recharge. So I think the next few months are going to be me recharging and kind of just rediscovering the joy of blogging. And yes, I'm prolific on the blog, but I have not been blogging as frequently over the last couple of years because of the writing the calculus book and holding down this full-time job. So a lot of what I'm going to be doing the next few months, I think, is just, really starting to blog for the love of it, and, feed my curiosity, feed your head, and see what develops first. I'm guaranteeing, because this is how it always happens with me, that at some point something's going to gel, and I'll go, yeah, this is it. This is the next book, and we'll see what happens.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, because I'm sure it will be something very interesting, because you always pick something with a great perspective and, find the interest, find what people are going to want to read about. So,
well, one of the big questions that I always ask is, what can I bring to this subject? Because there's a lot of people who are more knowledgeable than me about physics. And calculus. I mean, can I bring a unique perspective that will be interesting and informative and above all entertaining? Yeah. Because ultimately, even though I write science books, I want to write science books that are fun to read. I want the average person to make them want to pick up that book. I think Mary Roach is very good at this. People wait for the next Mary Roach because they know they're going to have a good time reading it. And that I think is what we should be striving for.
Well, keep striving. Thank you very much for joining me today, and our audience. I'm sure everyone has enjoyed it as much as I am. Everyone out there, if you are interested in learning more, you can find the Calculus Diaries. They're online. Her website, calculusdiaries.com. You can also read her blog, Cocktail Party Physics. Is cocktailpartyphysics.com, and you can find out more about Jennifer at Jennifer Ouellette, OUELLETTE-writes.com. And you can also find her on Twitter. Her what your alter ego, is that what we should call it?
Yes, it's my avatar alter ego, Jean-Luc Piquant. Makes it hard for people to find me on Twitter, but I couldn't resist.
Yeah, the alter ego, it came about with the blog, but it's I like it, very Star Trek-y.
Yeah.
Very Star Trek-y.
And very French. She has a beret.
Yes, she has a beret, and on Halloween she was a berated vampire.
Exactly.
So everyone out there, I urge you to check out the Calculus Diaries for a really interesting read, whether you are a math lover or someone very much like Jennifer herself, who started out saying, math? Why do I have to learn about math? What? You might find it very interesting. I'm Dr. Kiki, and this has been Dr. Kiki's Science Hour. We'll be back next week to talk about a British science uprising. That's right. The scientists in England have been moving upward. There's a movement. You can find other episodes of Dr. Kiki's Science Hour at twit.tv/Kiki. You can subscribe there as well. Subscribing to Dr. Kiki's Science Hour, this program really counts. It's like voting. You don't have to, you can watch us live. You can watch the show live. You can watch it after you've subscribed to it. You can do whatever you like, but please subscribe. It does help out our numbers a bit. You can also find me online if you look for Dr. Kiki. I'm DRKIKI on Twitter. And if you just Google Dr. Kiki, I'm out there. You can find my blog at drkiki.tv. And I also host This Week in Science, twist.org, and Green Tech Today here on the Twit Network, twit.tv/GTT. Once again, we'll be back here, same time, same place, 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific time on Thursdays. That's next Thursday. And I thank you for joining me for this hour out of your week, because, it's just 1 hour a week. That's all I ask. And it makes your world a whole lot more interesting. Bye. And I wish I could sing like, it's a math world. It's a math world,